Okay, as everyone seems to be coming online, we'll begin in about 1 minute. Okay, well, my name is Jeff Darabensky, and on behalf of the International Center for Youth Gambling and High-Risk Behaviors at McGill, and in collaboration with the National Council on Problem Gambling, I'd like to welcome you to the fourth of our series of this academic year. And this is the Raschkowan Lecture Series. And we're very grateful for the Raschkowan family for supporting this series. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Debbie LaPlante. I also want to thank Shamita and Keith from the National Council for Problem Gambling for all their work on this series. Dr. LaPlante is the current director of the Division on Addiction at Cambridge Health Alliance, which is a Harvard Medical School teaching hospital, and is associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Since joining the division in 2001, she has been involved with its diverse research, education, outreach activities. Along with her colleagues, she developed the syndrome model of addiction and is engaged in a seminal 10-year research program on internet gambling that was the first to use actual gambling recordings rather than just self-report data. She's authored dozens of book chapters, journal articles, and reports. And more recently, she co-edited the 2-volume Choice Awarded APA Addiction Syndrome Handbook. Dr. LaPlante is the author of the ebook on responsible drinking for women. She's currently involved in multiple federal and state-funded, as well as corporate-funded research programs examining a wide variety of mental health disorders. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. LaPlante today, who'll be talking about internet sports betting yesterday, today, and most of us are looking to see what's going to happen tomorrow. Thank you, and thanks for participating, Dr. LaPlante.
Well, thank you for having me today. It's certainly an honor to be selected to give one of these lectures, and I appreciate it. And I also appreciate everyone who's joined today giving a little bit of their time and attention to hear about the Division on Addiction's internet sports betting research. I'd like to start with our funding disclosures. The division's diversely funded by federal grants, state contracts, private foundations, and industry contracts. Of note, I'll be sharing data today from 3 of our funders, past and present, B1 Interactive Entertainment, Entain, and DraftKings. I also want to acknowledge the hard work that has happened to make this research available. On the left, you can see my current Division on Addiction colleagues. This presentation wouldn't have been possible without their dedication and commitment to producing objective and innovative research about addiction. I also should mention I'm a member of 2 boards. I sit as a commissioner on the New Hampshire Council on Responsible Gambling and as an advisory board member for Conscious Gaming. Today I'd like to cover 3 main topics. First, I'll describe what we have found related to typical internet sports gambling. In this section, I'll go over findings from our research collaborative programs with B1, Entain, and DraftKings. Second, I'll describe some of our findings related to signs of harm from internet sports betting. And specifically, I'll describe our observations about how sports betting activity is split between those at risk for gambling-related problems and others. And I'll also talk about a recently published study that examined markers of harm that have been used in a cohort of gambling companies in Europe to identify, flag, and intervene with people who might be gambling problematically. Third, I'll talk about where we suggest we need to go next as gambling and public health stakeholders. So I guess I'll start by saying a lot of people have tried to order the dangerousness of different types of gambling. And one of the questions I'm asked about most frequently is whether internet sports betting is distinctly dangerous compared to other types of gambling. And I think that one of the reasons that people are concerned about it is that we still know so little about how accessing gambling by using the internet might be different from other ways of gambling. And technology historically has tended to provoke these kinds of concerns. One example of this sentiment that I like to share is Mary Shelley's famous novel, Frankenstein. This 200-year-old book provided an early social commentary on the impact of technology on society. And in it, Mary Shelley noted that nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change. And to some extent, I think that this observation is reflected in concerns about gambling on the internet. People have shared technology-related concerns over time. Similar concerns have been expressed about technologies like the printing press and the radio and TV, and more recently, personal computers, the internet, and mobile devices. And historians have considered these patterns. One, Evelyn Ellerman, for example, wrote in 2007 about one of my favorite examples of humans' ambivalent relationship with technology, when she explained that for medieval society, installing mechanical clocks in public squares was controversial. A lot of people were against this technology. It was controversial because such things had the ability to redirect individuals' attention from eternity and spirituality to the present and the now. Indeed, Ellerman explains in her writings that people have long been haunted by the effects of technology on the individual and society as a whole. And consistent with society's fears related to new technologies, internet gambling has been met with a great deal of ambivalence and justifiable concern. An example of such fears is this suggestion by John Kent, who said, "The ability to put a gambling or casino app on a smartphone would be a recipe for economic disaster. That would truly be a killer app because the number of personal bankruptcies and people addicted to gambling would just absolutely soar." And this was in 2010, when we still had very little idea from a scientific perspective just how people might gamble using mobile devices. Now, the earliest scientific literature quite adamantly suggested that internet gambling would be substantially and severely different from other types of gambling, with increases in activity, involvement, and problems. This literature argued this for a variety of reasons, including the anonymity that remote gambling would provide, the availability of gambling in people's homes or wherever they were, the speed with which people could engage in gambling games, no longer requiring a trip to the casino to play a card game or a machine or to the store for lottery tickets, and questionable marketing practices that might have been used by the industry. And early studies seem to confirm these hypotheses. Both general population and special population studies suggested that those who gamble using the internet seem to be at higher risk than those who don't. One example is a well-done study, the British Gambling Prevalence Survey, which noted that whereas in the general population about 0.3% had problems with gambling, among those who said they gambled online, 5% had a problem. But estimates from this type of research vary quite drastically, and some special population studies, for example, suggest that nearly 50% of internet gamblers have gambling-related problems. So it's tough to make sense of the extent of the problem when findings are so different in the published literature. So although the estimates vary from study to study, the early studies of internet gambling were unified in one primary way, their methodological approach, which was self-reported gambling behavior. However, this methodology has some fundamental limitations that weaken its value on its own, such as recall bias due to faulty memory, question incomprehension, or comprehension but an urge to be mischievous in one's reporting, And self-report also can be limited by self-presentation biases, such as not wanting to admit to unsavory behavior. It's also limited because it can require research participants to complete some challenging mental arithmetic, and this is particularly true for gambling. And we know from recent research that this is an issue. For example, in 2014, we published research that compared actual gambling player records with self-reported gambling activity for the same period. We noted that what people said they did really matched what they actually did. And soon after this, Auer and Griffiths reported similarly that players, especially those with higher losses, tend to have difficulty reporting on their gambling accurately. And most recently, Aaron and colleagues reported similar findings. Specifically, they noted, I think that about 7.5% of people reported their wins and losses somewhat accurately, and a whopping 65% who had net losses underestimated their losses. So given these challenges of looking at self-reported gambling behavior on its own, in our work, we wanted to do something different. We wanted to understand internet gambling, not from self-reported information, but from actual internet gambling records. And we've been fortunate to have 3 large research collaboratives to support this work. From 2005 to 2014, we worked with BWIN to publish the first player record studies of internet gambling, including and mainly focusing on internet sports betting. From 2016 to 2020, we worked with DraftKings to publish a robust set of player record studies on daily fantasy sports. And since 2018, we've been working with Entain to complete follow-up and contemporary studies of internet sports betting and other online gambling. I'll start by taking us back to the beginning. Through our collaborative, BWIN provided us with 8 months of betting records for more than 40,000 sequentially subscribed internet gamblers from 2005. This was the first time a company had ever provided this kind of access to player records. The sample was a large majority male, more than 90%, and most were younger in age, about 30. This sample was European, including about 85 countries, and had a majority from Germany. BWIN provided us with an extensive set of gambling records, including betting behavior, such as the duration with which people were active players, their frequency of gambling while they were active players, the typical number of bets they made per day, the euros they placed for each bet, the total amount they wagered during the study period, and both their net loss and percent loss over 8 months. Our first goal for this data was to provide an epidemiology of sorts of actual internet gambling behavior. So we focused on providing descriptive information that could characterize typical and atypical internet sports betting. And this graph, for example, allowed us to examine whether internet sports play was mainly continuous, with gambling involvement growing gradually from little to the most, or was discontinuous, with an extreme group demonstrating outsized gambling activity. This graph really shows the total wagered over the study period. And you can see here that indeed, although most engagement as measured by total wagered was progressive and continuous in growth, when you get to the far right end of the distribution, there's a noticeable jump or discontinuity. The extreme 1% is wagering distinctly and differently more than the rest of the sample. And a head-to-head comparison shows just how different these players were from the rest of the sample. Whereas typical players were active for about 116 days and 23% of the time, those in the top 1% were active for 100 days more, and nearly 50% of the time. The top 1% placed double the bets on betting days and would bet a median of 44 euros for each bet, compared to 4 euros. The difference in total amount wagered is striking to me. Typical players spent a median of 148 euros over 8 months, and those among the top 1%, this amount was almost 17,000 euros. This translated into greater net loss for the atypical players, but interestingly, those players also had smaller overall median percent loss, 9% versus 29%. This indicates somewhat more successful outcomes for the extreme groups. So what did we take away from this first paper? Well, Overall, gambling behavior was much more moderate than what we expected based on published studies. Remember that many of those studies implied that gambling online would be associated with tremendous activity for basically everyone. Based on this, we anticipated that values would be greater than what we saw, and that we'd observe a larger extreme group than 1%. Yet 1% is nothing to ignore. A meaningful number of gamblers bet on sports and spent a disproportionate amount of their time and their money. In an interesting twist, those extreme bettors showed some evidence of more sports betting success than others, and we thought that that was intriguing. So, that was back in a sample from 2005, and it's 2022. So what do things look like today? As I mentioned earlier, through our current collaborative with Entain, we had the opportunity to find out. Entain now owns bwin, so we completed a 10-year comparative study on the same betting platform. We examined 8 months of sports betting records from more than 30,000 bettors sequentially subscribed during 2015, 10 years after the initial bwin sample. Like the earlier sample, the large majority was male and about 30 years old. The country representation included 88. And again, there was a majority from Germany, but it was more distributed than the 2005 sample. Entain provided us with betting activity records, such as duration and frequency, and also deposit activity records like numbers of deposits and average deposits amounts, and withdrawal activity records, including numbers of withdrawals, average withdrawal amounts, and more. We are interested in understanding how things might have changed over a decade, given the expansion of internet gambling during that time. These figures on this slide show you the patterns of engagement for the whole sample of 30,000 and more subscribers. As before, the x-axis has percentiles, the y-axis shows 3 different metrics from left to right: amount wagered, number of bets, and net loss. And what's important to notice here is that for each metric, amount wagered, number of bets, and net loss, people engage similarly. Most people engage similarly. And there's a small proportion, the large bars on the right-hand sides of the graphs, where engagement is fundamentally different. This time around, we found that about 2% of the sample exhibited this kind of disproportionate involvement on each metric. 2005, atypical most involved bettors were 1% of the sample. You'll also note that in the far right graph, our sample did include some net winners, and this is evident in the dip below that horizontal axis. We found considerable overlap between these 3 most involved groups, as this diagram shows. Net loss and total wagered had the most overlap, with the group that was top 2% on number of bets having less overlap. 19% of our sample were members of all 3 top 2% groups. And all 1,370 bettors fell into at least one of these 3 groups. And as you'll see on the next slide, the top 2% in terms of total wagered, net loss, and number of bets could be distinguished from the rest of the sample. Taking a look at the far right-hand side of the far right-hand column, you can see that typical gamblers from 2015 look a lot like typical gamblers from 2005, with a couple of exceptions. For example, duration was much shorter for the 2015 sample, with a median of 17 days versus 100 days. The contemporary sample also had a lower median number of bets. In contrast, frequency of play was much greater in the 2015 sample compared to the 2005 sample, and the current sample tended to wager more per bet. For the remainder of activity, including variables that are on this table, the samples looked quite similar. The most involved groups, in addition to being more involved on the metrics you'd expect, were more likely to place in-game bets than typical gamblers. These are real-time bets during events. However, the top groups on amount wagered and number of bets had better rates of return on their bets and were less likely to engage with combo bets. Combo bets are a particularly risky type of betting activity, and those who are highly engaged, those top 2%, but don't fall in the high net loss group, don't engage with them. The top 2% for net loss had a worse rate of return than the other 2 top % groups. and looked much more like the typical players in terms of their engagement with combo bets. And although it's not detailed here, you might be curious about net winners that we observed. Net winners are mainly similar to the total wagered top 2%. They have high monetary involvement, typical frequency. They're low on combo bets and high on in-game betting. However, they have considerably shorter duration of play. Potentially they hit it big and walk away, or potentially are specific sports specialists. So this study provided us some insight about a few things. We noticed that our sample characteristics were mainly the same, despite a decade passing between samples. However, the extreme bettor groups were larger, 2% instead of 1%, with just a few exceptions like frequency, duration, and total bets. Most of the median betting activity for the full sample also was similar to what we observed a decade earlier. Just as we noted them, for the majority, online sports betting is modest to moderate. And finally, looking at our extreme groups, we are able to determine that such atypical bettors are not homogeneous and potentially not necessarily disordered. We considered this to be a possibility because some of our highly involved groups avoid risky bets like combo bets and had better performance in terms of net loss. Finally, we had an opportunity to gain an understanding of the close cousin of traditional internet sports gambling, specifically daily fantasy sports. DraftKings provided us with 5 months of data from more than 10,000 sequentially subscribed daily fantasy sports players. Like our two traditional sports samples, most DraftKings players were male and in their early 30s. This sample was distributed across the US, with most players coming from California, Texas, and New York. We intentionally sampled to capture NFL fantasy sports players, and we're able to describe a variety of daily fantasy sports behaviors, such as number of entry days, duration of involvement, frequency of play, number of contests. We also were able to create a metric for the riskiness of games that players typically played that we called the player contest risk score. This score is a measure of the distribution and variation in prizes awarded for the contest. A high score indicates a top heavy prize distribution with high payouts, but low chances of winning. We were curious about whether daily fantasy sports was similar to traditional sports betting. At the time of this study, people expressed many of the same concerns about daily fantasy sports as they had about internet sports gambling played in the traditional way. As in our other samples, we first checked to see whether there was a noticeably distinct group of daily fantasy sports players. And as with our other samples, it was apparent, and here strikingly so. You can see in this example plot of total paid entry fees, a 1% group that engaged at distinctly greater levels than the rest of the continuously distributed sample. We noticed such differentiation for 3 variables that we examined: total entry fees, net loss, and number of contests. And in this figure, you can see the overlap among our identified extreme groups. Net loss and total entry fees overlapped the most, and number of contests was most independent. And all about 6% of our sample were members in all top 3 1% groups. And 218 players fell into at least one of these 3 groups. The extreme gamblers were distinct from typical daily fantasy players. For example, they played up to 9 times more entry days and entered up to 37 times more contests. The total amount spent on entry fees was dramatically higher, with the top 1% group on entry fees spending almost $12,000 and typical players spending a median of about $83 over 5 months. Top groups continued to do better than typical players in terms of percent loss, but overall percent loss was visibly higher for daily fantasy compared to what we observed for traditional sports betting. As a reminder, among typical players, median percent loss was 9% in 2005, 38% in 2015, and for daily fantasy was 54%. Among total wagered or total entry fees, extreme groups, In 2005, percent loss was 9%. 2015, just 1%. And for daily fantasy, it's 19%. Notably, the group with the best rate of return at 16% in those in the top 1% for number of contest plays also had the lowest median risk score for the games that they played. And the top 1% group with the worst rate of return, top 1% for net loss, also had one of the worst risk scores. This parallels our observation that those in our 2015 sports sample who performed best in terms of percent loss avoided riskier games like combo bets. So we learned a few things from this study. To start, daily fantasy sports shares some similarities with traditional sports betting. It's characterized by mild to moderate behavior overall, but also is highly skewed. Our daily fantasy sample was different, however, in that the likelihood of success seemed lower compared to traditional sports betting. Notably, success appeared to be associated with avoiding riskier propositions. Like traditional sports, there are distinct but somewhat overlapping sets of atypical players who play a lot. Yet being identified as an atypical player is not the same as being identified as a problem gambler. The atypical player tended to perform better, or at least comparably to the typical, in terms of percent loss, even if they spent more. Two groups of our extreme daily fantasy players didn't choose riskier games. Only those who were extreme in terms of net loss gravitated towards riskier types of games, not those who are atypical in terms of number of bets or total entry fees. So it seems that we can't assume that every atypical player is having a gambling related problem. But what do we know about gambling related problems among those who bet on sports? How many of them are there? How much do they contribute to the bottom line? Can we identify them at all from their behavior? And in this section, I'll try to answer some of those questions. One of the main concerns that a lot of people mention regarding internet sports betting is a possibility that the few people with gambling related problems are responsible for the large majority of wagering and spending and the industry's profits. And this tendency is apparent in a lot of consumer spending and in other areas. For example, analysts have noted that 20% of players who hit at least one home run account for the majority of all home runs hit in a season. And likewise, the Office of National Drug Control Policy reports that 14% of cocaine users are hardcore and responsible for 3/4 of cocaine expenditures. And these types of splits are evident in a lot of legitimate business as well. Other researchers have attempted to estimate this for gambling, but because people are so poor at describing how much they gamble, win, and lose, these spending distribution estimates might have limited value. But the question remains an important one. So we use our player records to better understand how economic activity was distributed among players. We looked to understand if internet gambling spending might be split according to what some have called the vital few, or those who make up the bulk of activity, and the trivial many, those who contribute much less. We merged our player records with screening data that indicated if a player was at risk for a gambling-related problem. Although player records have some advantages over self-reported gambling behavior, there are other aspects of gambling that do require introspection, including the experience of gambling-related problems. So we administered the brief biosocial gambling screen and obtained a sample of just over 1,300 players. With this sample, we asked two primary questions. First, is 80% of internet sports gambling attributable to the small minority of participants? And second, how does clinical risk relate to revenue distributions? And here's what we found. Almost all of our sample, 98%, made fixed odds bets, and the large majority, 79%, placed at least one live action bet. If you look at the far right-hand column, you can see that 16% of the sample accounted for 80% of the fixed odds turnover, or total wagered, and 7 and 18% were responsible for 80% of fixed odds hold or net loss and total fixed odds bets, respectively. This means that the vital few was responsible for most of fixed odds activity. For live action, it was even more extreme. Just 4% of the sample accounted for 80% of live action turnover, and 6 and 12% were responsible for 80% of live action hold and live action total bets, respectively. This also shows that the vital few, and even a smaller group of them, was responsible for most live action activity. So the principles of the 80-20 rule do apply, but in many cases, it's more extreme. The next question that we wanted to answer was how the activity relates to whether or not people have experienced gambling-related problems. Recall that we administered a screen called the Brief Biosocial Gambling Screen to identify these problems. For the BBGS, about a third of those who screen positive go on to meet criteria for gambling disorder with further assessment. So not all people who are positive have full-blown gambling disorder, but they have experienced at least one problem and are at risk for clinical levels of problems. In all, among our fixed odds bettors, 28% of the sample had a positive BBGS screening outcome, and 31% of live action bettors had the same. These very high rates are likely due to the sensitive screening measure we use and idiosyncrasies of our sample, including having a low response rate for participating and the time of data collection. This was back in 2005, and many in our samples could be considered early adopters of internet gambling, and early adopters tend to be more risk prone generally. The most important takeaways for this slide, though, are that those who played fixed odds and were BBGS positive were responsible for 52% of the total turnover. Those who played live action and were BBGS positive were responsible for 44% of the total turnover. And you can see that these folks were heavy contributors for both hold and total bets as well. The rough takeaway is that players who had experienced at least one problem composed a third of fixed odds and live action players and were responsible for about half of activity. And if we look at this from the other way around, by identifying the proportions of people with problems who make up the vital few versus the trivial many, we see additional cause for concern. You can see in the top row for fixed odds, BBGS positive players composed about 50% of each vital few group. In the bottom row, it's apparent that about 25% of each trivial many group includes BBGS positive players. The takeaway from this is that both groups include those who have experienced problems. So neither the vital few nor the trivial many can be used as a synonym for gambling related problems. And for live action, things look similar, but perhaps a bit more exaggerated. BBGS positive players composed about 50% or more of each live action vital few group, and about 25% of each live action trivial many group. I'll point out that the vital few for live action net losses were about 62% BBGS positive, which is quite a lot. Taken together, these observations suggest that the 80-20 rule is evident, but more extreme. And part of this is because internet gambling is a low effort activity and includes many registered but inactive or minimally active accounts. Part of it is the nature of the activity. And BBGS positive subscribers, those who have experienced at least one reported gambling problem or are at risk for gambling disorder, are about a third of the sample, but account for about half of turnover, hold, and bets for both fixed odds and live action sports betting. Finally, as a last set of charts show, those vital few who were responsible for so much betting activity are more likely to include BBGS positive subscribers than the trivial many. But again, it would be inappropriate to assume that all of the members of the vital few have such problems and to use vital few membership as a proxy for gambling disorder. Not all of the vital few report problems, and not all of the trivial many are safe from problems. So then what can we use? Many people have attempted and continue to try to find out. In fact, one of the earliest goals of player records research has been to identify markers of harm or behavioral markers for proxies of gambling-related problems, including outcomes like account closure, self-limitation and self-exclusion, screening results, and being flagged by customer service representatives for the need for account review for problem gambling purposes. Researchers have identified a number of different behavioral markers that are associated with these types of outcomes. Some include the variability of one's wagering, the number of different games that people play, or their breadth of involvement, the frequency with which people play while their accounts are active, the number of bets that they typically make. And this has even spawned an industry aimed at building predictive algorithms. Here's an example. This timeline covers 9 different gambling operators' efforts to use statistical analyses and machine learning algorithms to detect players at risk for future gambling harm. In all 14 instances listed here, the gambling operator uses their customer data and betting records and does not depend solely on customers' self-reported issues with controlling their gambling or problems that they might have. To obtain the entries on this timeline, we searched the internet and examined gambling companies' reports and white papers, press releases, and articles found on gambling journalists' websites. So I won't be surprised if there are more algorithmic efforts than depicted here, but my purpose is to show that this has been regularly pursued for about 15 years now. We had an opportunity to take a look at one of these predictive algorithm systems from the inside. Specifically, we examined aspects of an algorithm used by European operators and developed with the support of what was called the Senate Group, which today, as I understand it, is part of the UK Betting and Gaming Council. This algorithm was referred to as the markers of harm system. In this study, we examined the algorithm using 2 sportsbook player record samples to understand key questions that could impact the effectiveness of the algorithm for detecting need for intervention. Today, I'll highlight findings from 2 of the questions that we considered. First, we studied the usefulness of the included markers by asking, are they overly rare or common? And second, we examined whether markers were associated with proxies of gambling harm. The system that we studied included 9 markers, and they were spend from norm, frequency of play, increases in frequency of play, late night play, deposit frequency, failed deposits, having reversed withdrawals, making multiple payment methods, and use of credit cards for deposits. And each marker has a specific definition that helps determine whether players exceed a risk threshold. So for example, spend from norm is defined as depositing at least 2.5 times more in the past week compared to the mean of deposits on losing days in the past 6 months. It's kind of complicated. An easier to understand marker is frequency of play. And this is simply the spending at least 360 minutes wagering in the past week. Depending on what players did for each marker, the system assigns risk scores that range from no risk to low risk to medium risk to high risk. And the sum of the risk scores provides an overall risk score that ranges from 0 to 27, which guides interventions. Individuals are assumed to have no risk, or if their score ranges from 0 to 7, low risk or level 1 if it's 8 or 9, medium risk or level 2 if it ranges between 10 and 14, and high risk or level 3 if their score is between 15 and 29. This is what we learned about the commonness of each of the markers of harm. In our samples of sports bettors, the prevalence of people exceeding thresholds was very, very low. In fact, in the box on the left, you can see that on an average day, less than 1% of players were identified as more than no risk for each marker and for the overall risk score. In one exception, on an average day, only credit card use had an almost 2% in the low risk category, which was defined as using one credit card to make a deposit. For comparison, in developing system, they expected about 6% to exceed thresholds on an average day. And the graph on the right-hand side of the slide shows the percentage of players who, at any point during the study period, met low, medium, or high risk for each marker. In terms of overall risk, on the far right, for our 2015 sample, just 0.33% of players ever crossed the threshold for medium or high risk. In terms of the markers that people were most likely to ever reach, the medium or high risk categories, increased frequency led the way. Increased frequency refers to tendencies for at least 2 more hours wagering in the most recent week compared to average time spent wagering during all previous active weeks. And here we see that in the 2015 sample, cumulatively about 7.5% of players were ever considered medium or high risk during the 8-month study period. Results were similar for a 2005 sample. And all of this suggests that the likelihood of markers of harm system flagging individuals as meaningfully at risk on any given day is low, but people sporadically do reach these thresholds. Now, although the likelihood of people meeting the markers of harm threshold for intervention was incredibly low for an average day, the markers were associated with proxy outcomes. For example, you can see here the correlation coefficients between membership in top 1% groups for total bets and total wagered and each marker score, as well as overall risk, which is the first pair of columns on the left. Risk scores were strongly associated with membership in top 1% betting behavior groups, suggesting that markers were doing a pretty good job of identifying atypical extreme bettors. Now, we know that from what we saw in our first set of studies, that atypical extreme bettors aren't all players who have problems. So we also looked at some other outcomes like exceeding set deposit limits, lowering one's own deposit limits, and closing one's accounts. We noted that markers often were associated with different proxies of harm, specifically the percentage of users who ever fell into a certain risk category was higher for those who had experienced a certain gambling harm proxy than those who had not. For example, exceeding limits were about 9% were ever above level 1, but among those who never exceeded limits, just 0.5% were ever above level 1. So here I show overall risk level in our 2005 sample, for which we had these 3 proxies available to examine. And these elevated percentages also were often apparent and statistically discernible for individual markers, except in cases where counts were extremely low or high. So we take from this that the 9-variable marker of harm system had some pros and some cons. Weaknesses include the very low likelihood of detecting at-risk sports bettors on an average day. It's possible that the estimates might be in line with actual rates for sports bettors, or that the markers need to be calibrated better. Follow-up analyses suggest that the markers are indeed sensitive to changes in how you do these calculations, such as whether they're calculated for all active accounts or just those that were active on the day before calculation. So this needs to be investigated some more. On the other hand, these markers are associated with things like extreme group membership and several proxies of harm. Overall, our assessment is that to improve the likelihood of detecting at-risk bettors, it's possible that the markers will need to be calibrated and supplemented with additional markers that tap different dimensions of gambling harm. So the work to effectively detect at-risk players using online sports betting records is ongoing. So finally, I'd like to talk about where we go from here and what are some necessary next steps to take for improving our understanding of internet sports betting. To start, there are a few important limitations of the work that I described today. First, all of these studies have a single operator view, but many people who bet online do so on multiple platforms. Cross-operator data sets are essential to gaining a complete picture of typical and atypical online sports betting. Second, much of what we know talks about the strength of associations between patterns and outcomes. We know relatively little about causal pathways that might exist. Third, player records are so important, but their value increases if we can associate them with gamblers' introspection about harm and other experiences, even things that are positive. So we need more player surveys that can be linked to player records. Fourth, much of the work using player records for sports betting has occurred with European samples. The US is a different beast, and we need to do more to look at US player records for public health research purposes. I'd like to see some new specific directions in internet sports betting research. I'd like to see additional moves away from static markers, like simply number of bets, to dynamic markers that capture how changes in gambling might predict risk. As I just mentioned, I'd also like to understand causal relationships between playing patterns and risk outcomes, especially among cross-platform, cross-operator data sets. We need more player surveys that are linked with player records. This will be an important pathway to validating algorithms and developing new understandings of gambling harm and also gambling health. Such surveys can include outcomes like positive play and flourishing, so we can better understand what healthy gambling patterns might look like. In my opinion, this is as important as understanding unhealthy gambling patterns. And finally, we need more research evaluating interventions, especially those that are guided by automated algorithms. Given that a key responsibility of anyone implementing these types of features is to evaluate them and to do so in an ongoing way, for something like an algorithm, both the accuracy and the efficacy of the messaging need to be evaluated. And this figure here shows the steps needed to evaluate and approve responsible gambling programs. The first step is to develop and then implement the program. Next, you're going to want to develop some type of outcome monitoring system. After that, you're going to want to assess the penetration and impact of the program, analyze the outcomes, and then recommend and implement changes according to the research findings. This is not a point-in-time evaluation, but a continuous monitoring of the program and its effects. It should be repeated over time to monitor for changes in how players receive, interpret, and accept interventions. And then finally, I'd like to mention that a lot of these new directions will require the cooperation of the gambling industry. And this means that we need to have a very strong commitment to protecting research integrity. I believe that we can step in that direction by increased knowledge of and use of contemporary open science principles and practices. These practices were developed to address other threats to research integrity, namely the low replicability and the commonness of questionable research practices observed in many social science fields. But I think that they can be useful to address this issue for industry funding and cooperation that's been raised by many research stakeholders over time. What are these? So these principles and practices can be integrated into existing guidelines for working with the gambling industry. What this figure shows is such guidelines in black that were developed by Kim, Dobson, and Hodgins in 2016. And in blue, red, and green, you can see how 3 open science principles follow open science research development principles, follow open science reporting principles, and follow open science open access principles. Shows how they can be woven in. These principles strengthen research transparency, advancing planning, rigor, and bolster trust. They do this through practices such as research pre-registration, which is the public documentation of methods, ideas, hypotheses, and analyses before research begins. They also do this by the identification of pre-specified or confirmatory analyses and ad hoc or exploratory analyses. Doing this allows researchers to signal questions that are planned in advance and those that emerge during the research process. Results of the latter can be used for developing future research hypotheses and tests. And finally, open access principles allow for access to materials, publications, and data for new research questions or reproducing results, so we can have more confidence in published findings. Open science practices are relatively new to gambling studies researchers, and we know this from the absence of much public discussion of these approaches in the literature and in spaces like this, and from gambling researchers themselves. We had the opportunity to survey stakeholders who attended a major gambling conference in 2019. We asked them about their attitudes and opinions related to open science, and we were interested in how many had experience with such practices. And here's just kind of a taste of what we found. Fewer than half indicated some or extensive experience with open science practices generally. And this experience was uneven by the type of practice. For pre-registration, just about 1/3 said that they had some or extensive experience with the practice. And similarly, about 1/3 had experience with open materials or making their analytic code open. However, almost half reported experience with open data, and I think this is promising and will accelerate gambling research. However, just 16% reported some or extensive experience with preprint archiving. And this is an important way of publicly documenting the evolution of published papers and a way to create research access parity by making papers available for free. It would be great, I think, to see more researchers use this strategy. So currently, even though they have tremendous value, in my opinion, gambling researchers used open science in limited ways. Early and continuing education about this topic might be beneficial. Studies of open science practices suggest that they increase trust and confidence in research, and they provide other more academic benefits as well. For example, open access papers tend to be cited more than closed access papers. So thank you very much for listening to me today. I do see a bright future for our understanding of internet sports gambling. And I should note that I hope that Problem Gambling Awareness Month, which is wrapping up soon, I hope it has been informative and supportive and helped you stimulate new ideas about helping those who have problems with gambling. So thank you for your time today. I'm happy to take new questions before I need to leave for another webinar that starts at 1 o'clock. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. LaPlante, for an excellent talk. It's particularly appropriate because it's Problem Gambling Month, but also in the midst of the NCAA tournament, which is one of the largest sports wagering opportunities, certainly in the United States. If any of you have any questions, please put them either in the chat box or the Q&A box, and I can relay them on to Dr. LaPlante. While we're waiting, we only have a couple of minutes. I guess certainly the need for looking at empirical data from the industry is really important. You talked about global sports betting in general without talking specific sports or specific attributes of the individual like gender or age. So, there's a real concern amongst college-age students about gambling, especially gambling on sports-related activities. I wonder if you could comment on any differences that you've seen so far in your data with respect to, obviously, gender. There are more males gambling on sports than females, but if there's any differences that you may have noted or any age differences.
Yeah, well, in our three core samples, you'll remember that our samples were kind of very heavily skewed to be male, over 90% for all three of them. And they were for younger age. They had kind of a median age of, I think, around 30, which meant that there were a lot of people that were younger than that. And I think, certainly with the, especially the shifting sports betting dynamic in the US and the increased involvement with colleges and all of that, that's definitely an appropriate concern and something that we need to look at more. As far as gender differences, our samples were very unbalanced, but we did observe some gender differences. And if I'm speaking just kind of from memory here, I think that on some measures we saw that women were performing a little bit better in terms of their percent loss and things such as that. But I think that it's going to be consistent with what we see in the broader literature as far as the amount of involvement that men have, versus women in the way that they go about it, potentially, in riskier ways and more aggressively.
Well, thank you. It's certainly a growing concern, especially in the United States, as more and more states adopt legalized online sports wagering. If there are no other questions, because we're really running out of time, I just once again thank you so much for your time and your insight into this area. You and your team have extensively researched sports wagering, and certainly both the industry as well as clinicians and treatment providers learned a great deal. If you have any other questions, you can always address them to Dr. LaPlante at the email address that's provided here, as well as their website. So once again, I want to thank you on behalf of our center and the National Council for Problem Gambling for this really insightful, informative, comprehensive look at sports wagering. And we wish you continued success in studying this and addressing many of the questions that you actually raised. So thank you all for your part for attending. We're looking forward to the next year, academic year, and we will keep everyone informed. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.